Welcome to MarsCast, a podcast from Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where our faculty members address all things theological and cultural through a Reformed lens. I'm your host, Jared Luttjeboer, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Alan Strange, Interim President, Professor of Church History and Apologetics. Say hello to our listeners.
Jared, it's so good to be with you again. It's been a bit, and I've become, since we last talked, interim president, which means I've been drafted and tasked to help in the administration of Mid-America after the retirement of Dr. Venema, and as we look for a future, to the future for those who might serve in that. And so as such, I always like to say good things to our listeners, that we're thankful for them. We appreciate their support, both in prayer and in giving. And of course, you all know Mike Deckinga is our man who particularly is on the hustings, asking, and rightly so, that you support us. But also as president, I'll be asking that as well. We are grateful, as I say, for all of our supporters. We have many loyal ones for a long time, and we're thankful truly for that and for all your support.
Glad to have you here. Today we're continuing our series on church history with a special focus on the Middle Ages. Now, this era was a fascinating and complex time marked by tremendous theological debates and the shaping of doctrines that have had a lasting impact on the church. In particular, we'll be diving into later medieval theology and theologians. Now, we've explored the early medieval period in previous episodes, but today we want to shift our attention to the significant figures and theological contributions of the later medieval period. So, Dr. Strange, who are the key figures that we'll be discussing today? What were the strengths and weaknesses of their theology, and how did their work influence the course of church history?
Well, that's a lot of really good questions that you've just asked, Jared. Just to pick it up a little bit from where we were earlier, we particularly had talked about monasticism and scholasticism, and also mysticism as a kind of reaction in some measure to scholasticism. Scholasticism was something that some recognized as a too fine a distinction, something that could go to rationalism with the Christian faith, and some who were scholastics sort of seemed to bleed it dry a bit, some thought. So mysticism was a bit of a reaction to say, let's have some heart in this. And you could say the problem with rationalism, and I don't think scholasticism entails rationalism. It can go rationalistically, as many things can. Calvinism can go in a rationalistic direction if we don't balance it. And remember, revelation is always primary. So scholasticism and mysticism, if you want to say rationalism is the word without the spirit, you can think of mysticism as sort of spirit without the word. So this is, as you say, it's a very rich and rife time. Some of the figures that we're going to look at would be familiar. These are not obscure Middle Ages folks, though to a lot of our listeners, they may find them rather obscure just because folks don't know as much about the Middle Ages. We're moving towards the Reformation, but we'll think a bit about Anselm and Abelard and Bernard, and of course we're going to work our way to Aquinas in this or the next one, and Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. So those are a few of the names that we're wanting to deal with. Let me just say this to help orient our leaders, our listeners, many of whom are leaders, no doubt. I've been told by a few people that though they have listened to things I said, they would like to also see me, because I tend to be very visual. So you're going to have to visualize something here. I'm going to help you try to understand an illustration that a number of historians have used to kind of put it all together and understand the Middle Ages in terms of what comes before it and what follows it. So if you think of the left hand or the left arm, think of your left arm as sort of the pagan world. So the ancient Near Eastern world, the Babylonian, Egyptian, you can think of all that, but particularly the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, the Greek and Roman world. So if you think of that, and you think of the right hand as special revelation, so God's people of old, the Hebrews, and that comes into play, and we see Peter at Pentecost, where the church is constituted, those are all Jews of the diaspora there, it's constituted as the New Covenant church. It comes together. So you can think of that as the right hand, God's people of old, and now as the gospel goes global, he's going to be gathering from every nation and kindred and tribe and tongue. So you can think of that coming together in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is kind of an attempt in many ways that's rather intentional on the part of some. Certainly, say Thomas Aquinas is very intentional about trying to take, as he would see it, the best of the left hand, which would be for him ultimately Aristotle. When he would say to his assistant, "Hand me the philosopher," the fellow didn't say, "Well, who are we talking about here?" He knew he meant Aristotle. Right. Yep. So that's on the left hand, and the right hand would be that whole biblical world, and it comes together, you might say. So think of the chest, the whole upper part of the body then, to which the arms are attached. And then what's happened, and this is where we're moving, so I'm kind of giving a big picture to our listeners right now. What will happen in the Renaissance and the Reformation, but particularly the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, because we're going to talk about this a little bit, but you and I agree that there's a sense in which Reformation itself is sort of the last of the Middle Age. It's sort of the end of it. But we'll talk a little bit about that. That's something of a debate among historians. But what you have then on the bottom half with the left leg and the right leg is you have the splintering of this kind of unity that was apparently achieved. Notice how I'm putting that in the Middle Ages. So many would say that the kind of integral system that Aquinas was seeking, particularly between Aristotle and the Christian faith, was bound to unravel because it was an uneasy and tense relationship. And I think it is true to say that if you want to put it in terms that many of our listeners would be familiar with, it was a common grace sort of project, but Aquinas tended to overemphasize common grace and not have a sufficient view balancing that of antithesis. We need to understand both, that humans after the fall remain in the image of God, and they're able to do many things by the grace of God. That's common grace. But the whole of their being is affected by sin. We call that total depravity. And we're at enmity with God. And so while we have reasoning capacity, we typically don't rightly use our reason. We suppress the truth in unrighteousness, Paul says there. So the Reformation is going to come to appreciate more that whole aspect. Thomas Aquinas doesn't have the view of depravity that we have, or even what we would call the noetic effect of sin, which is the effect of sin on the mind. He doesn't quite have that view. He thinks that the fall involves the loss of the superadded grace, the donum superadditum, as it's called, and the loss of righteousness. But one is put back into a state where one can use one's reason fairly well, leading you up to the vestibule of faith, he would say. You can reason your way there, and then you do need faith. He always would say that. But I just wanted, that's a rather broad statement there to sort of set the plate.
So among the names that stand out in this period, there's a few that, I'd like you to briefly just touch on before we move on into the next episode. Anselm of Canterbury, a name perhaps familiar to many of our listeners, a man who was famous for the ontological argument for the existence of God.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, Anselm he's often said to be, his dates are 1033 to 1109, and he's said to be the first great scholastic by many historians. And just to remind our listeners that the heart of the approach of scholasticism, it's first of all a process, not a product. I mean, the scholastics have a product, which is their system, their theology, but it's a process which involves making distinctions whereby knowledge, particularly theological knowledge, is crystallized and clarified. A problem is first exposed, then disputed, leading to a new discovery in the individual. So Anselm, as a Platonist, he was a Platonist. I mentioned that that Aquinas becomes an Aristotelian, and that's a bit of something new because most Augustine, our listeners may recall, was a Platonist, a Neoplatonist. And so is Anselm. And he's very Augustinian. He's very in the Augustinian mold of believing that faith seeks understanding, that faith precedes knowledge. He was a thoroughgoing realist as well, believing that the universal is before the thing itself. There was a whole controversy that was called the realist nominalist controversy. Most historians now don't think that it was as significant as people had thought, because there are going to be those who are favoring the Reformation who are nominalists. Mm-hmm. So the notion that philosophical distinction was as important, even as people thought in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries. Most historians don't think it bore the kind of importance that it did. But let me specifically mention, you say the ontological argument. That's in a work. He has a work called the Monologion, which is really a prayerful treatise on the nature of God, and then again prayerful in his Proslogion, which he argues that God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. That's the ontological argument. Now, and that's really a brilliant sort of, I would prefer to call it an insight, as in terms of, it's not really a fully developed argument. And it is something, too, if you read it in the context of the Proslogion, he understands that this is something that would increase in the faith, particularly of a believer. In other words, this isn't just made in the absolute abstract. Mm-hmm. But he also very importantly wrote Cur Deus Homo, which is his masterwork on the atonement as satisfaction of the honor of God. He put it in those chivalric terms, but it will become satisfaction of divine justice made necessary by God's honor having been injured by man's sin. Previously, a lot of the talk about the atonement, you think of Gregory the Great or the Cappadocians, the talk was in the direction of it was a ransom paid to the devil. And he says no, Anselm says no, it wasn't that. And so someone who you might say is a foil for him, and also Bernard of Clairvaux, who Calvin really loved. Bernard of Clairvaux was a pious, highly ascetic mystic who believed God is known only as he is loved. So reason is not primary. For Aquinas, reason is primary. For Duns Scotus, we'll talk about him a bit later, will is primary. But for Bernard, affections are. You can, those of you who know something about Jonathan Edwards may hear something there. He was a Cistercian monk, a hymn writer. We have hymns from him. A mystic of a sort, but as I said, Calvin really loved him. He was one of the more solid figures here. And he, as well as Anselm, others engaged in some controversy with Peter Abelard. Abelard is somebody 1079 to 1142, and he was somebody who said not that I believe in order to understand, like Anselm said. He said nothing is to be believed until it's understood. He was really an intellectualist and he's sort of a progenitor of a kind of liberalism, you could say, because over against Anselm's understanding of the atonement in Cur Deus Homo, he had what's called a moral influence theory of the atonement, that Jesus died to show us how great God's love is, but not really to satisfy God's wrath. So those are some important figures: Anselm, Peter Abelard, Bernard of Clairvaux.
Thank you for joining us today as we explored the fascinating interplay of theology, philosophy, and history during the Middle Ages. From Anselm's ontological insights to the intellectual challenges posed by Abelard and the heartfelt mysticism of Bernard of Clairvaux, this period reminds us of the rich ideas that have shaped the journey of the Church. As you reflect on today's discussion, consider how the tensions between reason, emotion, and faith are still relevant in our own spiritual lives and communities today. How might these medieval debates encourage us to engage our minds and hearts in seeking God's truth? Well, in our next episode, we'll look further into the contributions of Thomas Aquinas, examining his ambitious synthesis of faith and reason and its implications. We'll also turn our attention to the Avignon papacy, a period marked by controversy and division in the Church, and more pivotal figures of the era. This has been MarsCast from Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm Jared Luttjeboer, signing off for now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.